Each day, our newspapers, magazines, radios, and television screens are filled to overflowing with images of people fleeing territory controlled by the Islamic jihadist group known as ISIS. More than half of the 653,000 refugees, an estimated 53% in Europe, are from Syria alone, according to the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. While violence plays the major part in the impetus of Syrians to leave their homes, Shelley Petterman of the UNHCR testified at a hearing I chaired on October 20th that the main trigger for the flight from refugee camps or shelter in nations like Jordan is the humanitarian funding shortfall. In recent months, he told us that the World Food Program cut its program by 30%, and the current Syrian Regional Refugee and Resilience Plan for 2015 is only 41% funded. The UNHCR expects to receive just 47% of the funding it needs for Syria over the next year. 1 year ago this month, the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs issued a report that detailed the worsening humanitarian situation in Syria. An estimated 12.21 million people were in need of humanitarian assistance, including 7.6 million IDPs, or internally displaced people, and more than 5.6 million children in need of assistance. An estimated 4.8 million people were in need of humanitarian assistance in hard-to-reach areas and locations. Those numbers definitely have not improved as the conflict has continued and worsened. By the third International Pledging Conference on March 31st of 2015, the crisis had become the largest displacement crisis in the world, with 3.8 million people having fled to Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, Iraq, and Egypt, in addition to those internally displaced. In support of the Syria Response Plan and Regional Refugee and Resilience Plan, international donors pledged $3.68 billion in money. However, according to the Financial Tracking Service at the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, only 1.17 of the $2.89 billion has been received by December 7th. That constitutes only about 41% of what was considered necessary by that agency. Today's hearing will focus on the plight of persecuted minorities, religious minorities in Syria and in Iraq, which today constitutes genocide, and the failure of much of the international community to live up to their pledges of humanitarian assistance, factors which push refugees to Europe and beyond. In particular, we will examine violence targeting religious minorities such as Christians and Yazidis in territory controlled by ISIS in both Syria and Iraq. This past September, the Simon Skote Center for the Prevention of Genocide at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum undertook a, quote, bearing witness trip to northern Iraq to investigate allegations of genocide being committed by ISIS. Their report is chilling. Our generation is gone, the Islamic State's targeting of Iraqi minorities in Nineveh. And in it, they talk about severe deprivation, rape, sexual slavery, enslavement of many kinds, and murder perpetrated in a widespread and systematic manner that indicates a deliberate plan to target religious and ethnic minorities. Mira Ismail, chairman and founder of the Yazidi Human Rights Organization International, will testify today that the Yazidis are on the verge of annihilation. Chaldean Bishop Francis Kalabat will testify that, quote, there are countless Christian villages in Syria who have been taken over by ISIS and have encountered genocide, and the Obama administration refuses to recognize their plight. Carl Anderson, Supreme Knight of the Knights of Columbus, calls on the Obama administration to publicly acknowledge that genocide is taking place against the Christian communities of Iraq and Syria. Mr. Anderson will testify that, quote, vulnerable religious minorities fear taking shelter in the camps of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees because of religiously motivated violence and intimidation inside the camps. Syrian Christians, he notes, and other vulnerable minorities are disproportionately excluded from the U.S. Syrian Refugee Resettlement Program due to reliance on a functionally discriminatory UNHCR program. So that's where the mistake is initially made, and systematically Christians are excluded. Dr. Gregory Statton, president of Genocide Watch and research professor at George Mason University, in his testimony entitled Weak words are not enough, states failure to call ISIS mass murder of Christians, Muslims, and other groups, in addition to Yazidis, by its proper name, genocide, would be an act of denial as grave as U.S. refusal to recognize the Rwandan genocide in 1994. And I would note parenthetically, I was in Congress in 1994. I was at the UN Commission for Human Rights in Geneva and worked side by side with those in the administration at that time, and there were some who demanded that the Rwandan genocide be called what it was, and there was a refusal. The same thing happened in Bosnia, and it happened elsewhere, and that terrible experience now replays itself over and over again, and it's replaying now. Ethnic cleansing, what does that mean, as Dr. Stanton says in his testimony? The administration reportedly is considering declaring the ISIS mistreatment of Yazidis to be genocide. Frankly, that's good. I encourage that. But there is no indication that Christians will be included. That's absurd and unconscionable. Such an action would be contrary to the facts and tragically wrong. Last year, the UN resolution determined that both Yazidis and Christians were being particularly targeted by ISIS. A group of Christian leaders last week wrote to Secretary of State John Kerry to present their case for treating Christians the same as Yazidis in this matter, but they have not yet received a reply, and hopefully it'll be a positive one. As we attempt to end the ISIS threat, we must consider how to help ensure religious pluralism in Syria and Iraq in the future, and that will not be an easy task, since animosities have grown during the conflicts in Iraq and Syria exponentially, so during the rise as and the reign of terror of ISIS. Nevertheless, unless we consider how to make these lands safe for religious minorities, we will continue to see them chased out of their traditional areas, even if there is no ISIS. Our witnesses today will provide us a picture of the ongoing struggle, provide us hopefully with some recommendations that can be acted upon, being faced by these religious minorities, and hopefully they will help us to begin to make this issue more prominent, and that the designation of a Christian genocide will be declared. I would again note parenthetically, several years ago I chaired a hearing, and I had several since, on the plight of Christians. And we had a representative from the administration who, when instance after instance was detailed by the other witnesses, he said over and over again, and I don't want to embarrass him, but he said over and again, let me take that back and take a look at that, as if there was a lack of awareness about the gravity of people being beheaded and told you either change your religion on the spot here or you will be slaughtered. In like manner, we had a witness that I met in an IDP camp in Jos, Nigeria. That man actually had a Boko Haram terrorist put an AK-47 to his cheek on the ground and said, you renounce your faith as a Christian or I'm going to blow your brains out. He said, I'm ready to meet my Lord. His wife was pleading and sobbing. They pulled the trigger, or he pulled the trigger, the Boko Haram terrorist, blew half his face away, and when he testified, and you'll recall, you could have heard a pin drop here. He had nothing but love and compassion for his oppressor, and he was the one, and thank God he survived, to tell that story. We need to promote, first recognize what's actually going on, call it what it is. We didn't do it in Rwanda. We haven't done it in other places, and do it now. Ms. Bass.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.